And I believe that these things need to be repented for, because this is not a good witness to Jesus or the New Testament. It's not true, and it justifies a lot of sin against the Jewish people. Welcome to Chosen People Answers, where we strive to seek truth, find God, and know Messiah. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Crawford. Welcome to the third and final episode of my series on anti-Semitism and the New Testament. For this video, I'm going to complete the historical story by explaining how the religious movement based on the New Testament, which is now known as Christianity, eventually became supporting of anti-Semitism over time. Now, I don't believe that it started that way, but it became that way, and it doesn't have to be that way today. Christianity does not, in the 21st century, need to be supporting anti-Semitism. This video is available in written article form on chosenpeopleanswers.com. You can find links in the video description. I also highly encourage you to watch this in video form, as I will be presenting a lot of charts and graphics to go along with the spoken material. With the rise in anti-Semitism today, including from within the church, I hope that you will share these episodes on your social media accounts. But these episodes, like all of our videos on Chosen People Answers, are addressed specifically for Jewish people. You are grappling with anti-Semitism every day, and sometimes it comes from those who claim to follow Christ. I hope that these episodes give you the courage to push back. And so, let us continue with this third and final episode, how Christianity became anti-Judaic over time, with a brief historical overview. And so there are several books that I've got up on screen now that are academic works on what is called the parting of the ways. And before we actually get into how Christianity became anti-Semitic over time, I first want to describe a separate phenomenon that is somewhat related, but how these two different groups, Jews and Christians, came to be seen as two different groups. Because remember, we started our conversation in episode 1 about how the New Testament is written by Jewish people. It happened in Judea. It is describing a Jewish man who went preaching in Judea and Jerusalem and the temple, and it was a purely Jewish movement. And how did that purely Jewish movement then become a predominantly Gentile movement? How did it separate from its mother religion of the pre-Christian Judaism that it came from? And so the books on the screen are highly recommended works that talk from a historical perspective how these things happened. The first one is called Jewish Believers in Jesus, the Early Centuries. This book is excellent in going through the historical and the textual evidence and even the archaeological evidence for Jewish believers in Jesus for the first, say, 5 centuries of the church, and how these Jewish believers sought to keep their identity as Jewish people, how they interacted with church fathers and regular Gentile Christians, and how they influenced actually early Christian theology. And this is a really excellent and one-of-a-kind book. The next one is called Borderlines. This is by Daniel Boyarin. He is a Jewish scholar, and he talks about how the two religions came from initial stock. The next is called Jews and Christians, The Parting of the Ways, AD 70 to 135, edited by James Dunn. And this has a series of essays about how the two groups separated. And then finally, the book Within Judaism that I've already highlighted previously in these episodes. It talks about how the New Testament and the original Jewish followers of Jesus, they saw themselves as within Judaism, and how they can be credibly recontextualized as being within at least a first century Jewish definition of what Judaism is. So I would encourage you, if you want to go deeper with academic works, these are good places to start. But now let's actually talk about the historical process of how these two ways parted. And so I'm going to go through this chart that I have up on the screen. This is a chart that I use when I teach in churches about this issue. And we're going to start from the left and work our way all the way to the right. So this is a timeline that where we start around 32 CE or earlier, maybe 30 or 32 CE, before Jesus' crucifixion. In first century Judaism, like we have talked about, we had different Jewish sects, different Jewish groups. You had Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, diaspora Jews, and then the many other categories of Jewish groups that we talked about in episode 1. Now, all these groups had similarities. They also had differences. And when scholars look at these different groups, they have a question. They say, was there one Judaism in the first century, or was there multiple Judaisms? And different scholars have different opinions on that. It really comes down to how much you see is common in between them and how much you see is different between them. But in any case, these different groups, they all saw each other as Jews, and they spoke the languages of Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. And they spoke Greek because of the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. And so the entire Mediterranean basin, they spoke Greek, and that included most Jewish people. Well, then we have our first paradigm shift. There was a major change that rocked the system here. That is Jesus' ministry and his resurrection from the dead. Now, I believe that there is good historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection from the dead. It's not just a myth, it's not just a fairy tale, but it actually happened in real time and space in history, and our channel will be talking more about that at a later date. But Jesus' ministry and his resurrection, it was a dividing line in the sand, because after that point, you had all these different Jewish people coming from different Jewish sects who were all saying, hey, we saw Jesus alive from the dead, and he's the Messiah, we believe in him. And so that split these pre-Jesus Jewish groups now into those in that group who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and those in that group who did not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So now we have Pharisees and Messianic Pharisees, Sadducees and Messianic ex-Sadducees. Why ex-Sadducees? Because you had to believe that at least one man rose from the dead, Jesus of Nazareth, if you were going to follow Jesus as the Messiah, and that meant that you had to get rid of your rejection of the resurrection from the dead. We don't have any direct evidence that there were Essenes who believed in Jesus as the Messiah, so I'm putting Messianic Essenes with a question mark. And then we have Messianic diaspora Jews. These were Jewish people who were in the exile and the diaspora, some who believed in Jesus and some who didn't. Now, I've colored these groups in two different ways. You've got the blue, who held to the beliefs from before Jesus' ministry and resurrection, and then the new green color, referencing that this is a new group or subgroup of Jewish people who hold to new beliefs that Jesus rose from the dead, and that proves that he is the Messiah. And this created an inter-family dispute about Jesus, where you have families and groups of Jewish people who disagree among themselves. And Jesus even says, there's going to be father and mother who are separated from each other, and son and daughter who disagree with each other, all because of me, Jesus said. And so this is an inter-family Jewish dispute. There's no Gentiles part of this. And we're talking here between, say, 32 CE or 30 CE, whenever Jesus' crucifixion was, and 70 CE, where this is an inter-family Jewish dispute. As time goes on, more Gentiles are coming to faith in Jesus, but we're talking about in first century Judea and in the diaspora, where this was a current debate in the Jewish community. Then we have the second paradigm shift. This is when the temple is destroyed in 70 CE. And this creates chaos and confusion for the entire Jewish world. And emerging from that chaos and confusion come the parting of the ways. Because the temple and Jerusalem, it was that central hub that brought all Jews together. And it brought them together in worship, it brought them together in the festivals, it brought them together in Torah observance. And once you have the temple gone, then all of that is up for grabs. How are you supposed to celebrate the festivals when you can't actually go to Jerusalem and you can't actually celebrate at the temple? And so this created chaos and confusion, and you have two different groups that splinter off from this. The first is post-temple Christianity, and the second is post-temple Judaism. Let's talk about post-temple Christianity first. As you can see here, I have colored it with a gradient going from green to yellow because it starts out as a Jewish movement, and then over time, there is a new overwhelming influence that comes into post-temple Christianity, and that is Gentile Christians. And simply by force of number, colored yellow, post-temple Christianity becomes yellow. It's not green anymore, simply because there are so many more Gentiles by just sheer numbers than there are Jewish believers in Jesus in post-temple Christianity. And so that transition there means that it becomes more of a Gentile religion. And that eventually turns into Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant Christianity that is just a straight yellow. You just don't really see much Jewish influence at all in those branches of Christianity. And that means that Jewish Christians are kind of forgotten. They're the green that was so prevalent at the beginning. Now it's just a historical footnote. It's not a present lived reality. And in post-temple Christianity, the predominant languages that are spoken are Greek, Latin, and Syriac. And that means that there is some continuity with the Greek from before, but you'll notice they don't keep Hebrew. And Syriac it's a form of Aramaic, but it's a more Gentile form of Aramaic, okay? And so we see a linguistic shift with post-temple Christianity away from Hebrew towards Greek and Latin predominantly. Now let's go down to post-temple Judaism. It starts off as blue, light blue, referencing the kind of Judaism that was around before Jesus came, but it transitions to a dark blue. Why? Because there is a new overwhelming influence on post-temple Judaism, and that is the rabbinic sages, with the rise of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and over time, post-temple Judaism becomes the religion of rabbinic teaching. Now, there was a process by which that happened. It did not happen right from the beginning. There's the legend of the Council of Yavne and how right off the bat, after the destruction of the Second Temple, then the rabbis take control of the Jewish people. Well, we know from literary accounts and also even from archaeology that this was a historical process that took several centuries before the rabbis actually had institutional control over most of the synagogues in the known world. And one of the ways that we see that is that the sages say that the synagogue needs to be oriented towards Jerusalem in a certain way. And we've done archaeology of synagogues in the 4th, 5th, 6th century that don't follow what the sages required. And so that shows that the sages didn't have control over those synagogues in that time period. And many scholars today believe that the sages didn't really have full control over the ways and means of Judaism until really the period of the Muslim conquests in the 7th century and later. But that's a side note. So now we have a transition to a dark blue post-temple Judaism, which becomes Orthodox Judaism, the kind of orthodoxy that we are familiar with today. Sure, there's been modern developments, but Mishnah-centric, Talmud-centric, and then when you get into the Middle Ages, now with Maimonides and Kabbalah. And the non-rabbinic Jews are forgotten during this time period. It is a dark blue, Orthodox Jewish, rabbinic-dominated religious system where the variety of beliefs in the light blue from before these paradigm shifts, they're kind of lost to history. Now, I forgot to mention that post-temple Christianity and post-temple Judaism really start separating in a more accelerated way after 135. And the reason here is because 135 is the date of the second Roman conquest of Jerusalem, where they actually took all the Jews who were still living in Jerusalem after 70 CE, and they said, no, Jerusalem is no longer a Jewish city. No Jew is allowed to step foot within the walls of Jerusalem. This is going to be a Gentile city. Aelia Capitolina is what they started calling it, to stamp out all Jewish presence. And basically what that meant is that the mother church of post-temple Christianity, which was there in Jerusalem, was basically eradicated. The church in Jerusalem then became a Gentile institution after that point. And when you don't have any mother church with Jewish bishops and Jewish leaders, this parting of the ways just accelerated even more. And the dark blue with post-temple Judaism, they repudiated Greek eventually. There's actually some positive views about the Greek language in the Talmud, but eventually they repudiated the use of Greek. And they said, we just need to have our religious texts in Hebrew and Aramaic. And so then they eventually forgot how to speak and write Greek. And that meant that all of those Greek writings from Second Temple Judaism, they just were lost to Jewish memory, and only Christians were reading Second Temple Jewish works written in Greek. And so now we have a language divide between post-temple Christianity and post-temple Judaism, where they're not reading each other's mail. They're not reading each other's works. And so they don't really know what the other side is believing so much. So that is a general overview from a 30,000 foot level of how the parting of the ways actually took place. But for the rest of our time, now we're going to talk about a parallel historical phenomenon where post-temple Christianity became more and more anti-Judaic over time. It started out as a Jewish movement, and then as it got more and more yellow over time, then it started picking up anti-Jewish beliefs and doctrines. And now I want to track that for us. And the key word here that I mentioned in episode 1, but now we're going to go more in depth, it's called supersessionism. And I'm going to define it here for us. Supersessionism is the belief that the promises, covenants, blessing, and election bestowed upon the Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible have, 1, been transferred to Christians, and 2, been abrogated, canceled, or made obsolete for Jews. Now, I put an or there for that last one. You're going to have different Christian supersessionists. We're going to say, oh, well, I don't believe that the promises were canceled. I believe that they were transferred to the church, or I don't believe that they were made obsolete because they're still current in a certain way for the church. So they may differ on the nomenclature here, but when it comes to Jewish people who do not believe in Jesus, it's either the abrogated, canceled, or made obsolete for them. Now, I believe that this is flatly contradicted by Romans 11, 28, and 29, which we have referred to previously in this series, where the Apostle Paul says, as regards election, they, that is non-Jesus following Jews, are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. That last word is so important. Irrevocable means it can't be undone. It can't be abrogated. It can't be canceled. It's not going to be made obsolete. That when God promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, then he will do it. And even if there is a judgment upon the nation, say in Deuteronomy chapter 28, well, there's a restoration promised in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. And that has not been canceled. So there's a restoration coming. And so I believe that this belief of supersessionism is erroneous and wrong. It is against Scripture. And yet, it eventually became the default theology of the church, unfortunately. And I've got some books up here on the screen that go in depth with how supersessionism eventually took root in the church's theology and practice, and how it wasn't always that way, but it became that way over time. And so I would recommend each of these up on the screen for those of you who want to go deeper on this. But I do want to make an important caveat here. Supersessionism is not the same thing as anti-Semitism. Okay? They are two different things. I believe they're related to each other, kind of like cause and effect, or the grounds for something, and then the fruit that grows from the ground. But they are two different things. I believe that supersessionism is the ideology that fuels Christian anti-Semitism. It doesn't necessarily lead to Christian anti-Semitism, but it's kind of the precondition for Christian anti-Semitism. I believe that there are a few more ingredients that are needed to jump from supersessionism to overt anti-Semitism, and I believe that the key ingredient is the belief in the ethics of coercion in religion. Coercion, of course, meaning I or some authority has the moral right to force you to believe something other than what you believe. And in the case of Judaism, that there are secular and religious authorities who have the moral weight and justification to force Jews to stop believing what they believe, or to put pressure on them, whether physically or financially or some other pressure, to force the Jews to give up their beliefs or to at least not be effective in the world anymore, to punish them for their beliefs. That is the ethics of coercion that I totally reject. And I believe that early Christianity also totally rejected coercion in religion. Let me give you some examples. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7 includes Jesus saying, "Do good to your enemies, turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile," with coercive Roman soldiers. That's the background. If a Roman soldier says, "Hey, carry my baggage for a mile, you dirty Jewish person who is subjugated under Rome," Jesus says, "Okay, then walk with him for 2 miles and show him how much bigger of a person you are because you actually follow a good God who is merciful to people who hate God." Jesus also says, "Don't be angry with your brother." In the parable of the weeds in Matthew 13, Jesus denies that humans have the authority to coercively remove non-believers from their midst. He basically says, leave them alone. When Jesus was arrested, Peter pulled his sword to attack the guards. Did Jesus say, "Yeah, go for it, Peter"? No, he said, "Peter, sheathe your sword." He rebuked Peter for trying to use force in protecting Jesus. Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. Live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written in Deuteronomy chapter 32, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.'" Then we have the church father Tertullian. In around 211 CE, he says, "It is a fundamental human right, a privilege of nature, that every man should worship according to his own convictions. One man's religion neither harms nor helps another man. It is assuredly no part of religion to compel religion, to which free will and force should, and not force, should lead us. You Romans will render no real service to your gods by compelling us to sacrifice." Now, the context here of Tertullian is Rome is forcing Christians to sacrifice to pagan gods and to the Roman emperor himself. And he's basically saying, stop it. Stop forcing us to do this. This is not right. Now I'm going to give you another church father, Lactantius, who's writing around 320 CE. And he is writing around the time when all of this is about to change. Okay, he's kind of the end of an era of rejecting coercion in religion. And the reason why is because Constantine became emperor and he started issuing changes that we'll talk about here in a second around the time that Lactantius is writing. And so this is kind of the end of an era. And so let me read his very strong support of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. He says, "For religion is to be defended, not by putting to death, but by dying, not by cruelty, but by patient endurance, not by guilt, but by good faith. For the former belong to evils, but the latter to goods. And it is necessary for that which is good to have place in religion, and not that which is evil. For if you wish to defend religion by bloodshed, you Romans, and by tortures, and by guilt, it will no longer be defended, but will be polluted and profaned. For nothing is so much a matter of free will as religion, in which, if the mind of the worshipper is disinclined to it, religion is at once taken away and ceases to exist. The right method, therefore, is that you defend religion by patient endurance or by death, in which the preservation of the faith is both pleasing to God himself and adds authority to religion. But we, on the contrary, do not require that anyone should be compelled, whether he is willing or unwilling, to worship our God, who is the God of all men. Nor are we angry if anyone does not worship him, for we trust in the majesty of him who has the power to avenge contempt shown towards himself, and also he has the power to avenge the calamities and injuries inflicted on his servants. And therefore, when we suffer such impious things, we do not resist even in word, but we remit vengeance to God, not as they act who would have it appear that they are defenders of their gods, and rage without restraint against those who do not worship them. You can just hear the moral high ground that he is taking here. This ethic of non-resistance in violent resistance. They're still resisting, but they're not actually fighting back. And they are saying, we're going to win in the end because you're showing yourself to be morally deficient in how you have to defend your religion with violence. And so that's around 320 CE. And so my next question is, what changed? How did we get from where I've just been taking us to what happened later? Here's how it happened. In 313 CE, Constantine, the Roman emperor, he declared Christianity a legal religion, and he merged ecclesiastical authority, that is church authority, with the political state. Thereby, Christianity became Christendom. Christianity plus a secular kingdom melded together. Number 2, Constantine sought to unify the church through political force. Number 3, Constantine coerced a schismatic group called the Donatists into renouncing their position on pain of loss of life, limb, and possessions. This was a group of Christians who said that if you sacrificed to Caesar during the persecutions, when the Roman government was forcing Christians to do so, you cannot be remitted back into communion in the church. It was a very ungracious and non-forgiving opinion, and Constantine, following the decisions of the majority of the bishops of the church, said, no, you can't teach that, and so I'm going to take all your churches and your possessions, and I'm going to force you out of existence. Number 4, a century later, Augustine, so he lived from the years 354 to 430, he became the church's most eloquent theologian, and he changed his position on coercion. Initially, he was against coercion, and then he was in favor of coercion in religion. Here was his logic. Citing the success of eradicating Donatism in the church, Augustine argued that the Catholic Church has the authority to coerce heretics into true belief and to purge pagans from their midst. He practiced a kind of consequentialist ethics that basically says, look at the consequences of an action. If the consequences are good, as I determine it, then the action was good. Another way of saying this is the ends justify the means. Augustine said that Constantine persecuted the Donatists, forced them with all these political means, and hey, look, a century later, there's no more Donatists. It worked. Therefore, we should replicate this whenever there are schismatics and heretics in the church. But here's the thing. Augustine made a single exception. The Donatists were a Christian schismatic group. He made an exception to this when it came to the Jewish people. He said, the Jews are not to be killed, but protected from death. Yet, they must not be allowed to thrive. They are to be a witness people in subjugation to Christians, vividly displaying the triumph of Christianity and the condemnation of Jewish people. Augustine justified the use of Christian political coercion to force Jews into ghettos, to keep them separate from Christian society, to not allow them into Christian universities, into Christian guilds, to force them only into certain professions, like being bankers. All of that happened in the Middle Ages, but all of that was based off of the logic that Augustine provided here. Because again, Augustine became the most influential church father for about 1,000 years. And so this is the logic of the Inquisition. This is the logic of the ghettos. This is the logic of so much that was to come. Number 7. Thus, coercion in religion was brought into the church's theology, ethics, and politics. And rejection of coercion was not regained in Christian circles until the English-speaking Protestants of the 17th century, when you have the rise of what was called tolerance in light of the 30 Years' War, and you have different Christian philosophers who are arguing for freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and all of that became the grounds, the philosophical background that led to the United States founding with the Bill of Rights, with there being a freedom of religion baked into the Constitution of the United States. And so between Augustine and the Bill of Rights of the United States, you've got over 1,000 years where coercion in religion was the norm. It was the standard. And that is a really dark history of Christian ethics. And that is the reason why the United States became such a haven for Jewish people right from the beginning of its founding. That there have been Jewish people who have seen the United States as a promised land, as a golden place to emigrate to, because it is the only place in all these centuries where there has been an absolute freedom of thought and freedom of religion. And so I say this to my shame and my Christian ancestors' shame, because there's a lot of centuries there where this was really, really bad history. So I believe that Christianity was not originally supersessionist and anti-Semitic, but it became so over time. And the anti-Semitic Christian stew consists of theological ingredients, ecclesiastical ingredients, and political ingredients. And all of these were added to the recipe during the first 5 centuries after Jesus. Now, my point of this stew analogy is to say that only some flavors of Christianity are anti-Semitic, but those flavors are poisonous and corrupt. It is the duty of contemporary Christians to reject these ingredients and to recover the pro-Jewish flavor of the earliest Jewish Jesus followers. And so there is a stew called Christianity, but there's different recipes. And I don't believe that anti-Semitism is an essential ingredient to the recipe of faithful New Testament Christianity, that it is actually a poison that has been added to the mix. And so we need to remove that poison. We need to go back and we need to undo it. And so what were these ingredients? How are they added over time? How am I saying that this is not part of the essential core of Christianity, but it became so over time? Well, let's go through each of these 3 categories: theological, ecclesiastical, and political ingredients. And we're going to do so with some very busy charts on the screen. Now, these charts come from the written article form of this video, and this chart has a lot of footnotes attached to it. So I would encourage you to actually look for this article on chosenpeopleanswers.com. You can also find it in the Mishkan Journal, where this was first published, and you'll find a lot of footnotes here justifying these claims that I'm making. But I'm going to go through each of these theological and ethical ingredients on this chart, and then we're going to go to ecclesiastical and political ingredients on the future charts. But right now, we're going to start with T1 and work our way through T6, meaning theological ingredient. The first one, T1, is the chosenness of the Jewish people is denied and replaced by the chosenness of Christians of any background. The result of this ingredient is the basis for theological rejection of Jewish people. Basically, the Jewish people retain their chosenness, retain their covenants with God, retain their promises with God, only so far as they believe in Jesus. If they don't believe in Jesus, they're cut off. It's done. They're done. There's nothing left for them. They're an obsolete people group. Okay? I believe that this is rejected in the New Testament by Paul. It's rejected today by Messianic Jews and also by many premillennialists, those Christians who read the Old Testament literally and actually believe that there will be an actual restoration of the Jewish people because of God's promises to Abraham and to his descendants. And so this is not something that all Christians agree upon, but T1 is the root of this supersessionist belief. T2, this is that the Jewishness of Jewish people is seen as an irreconcilable obstacle to faith and or obsolete. That Jewishness is a problem for Christians to solve rather than something that is at the core of what Christianity is. The result of this T2 belief, it's the basis for de-Judification. It's saying, oh, well, we're not going to practice those things as Christians because that's what Jews do. And we're the opposite of Jews. So we're not going to do those things. And so let's de-Judify the church. I believe that this is rejected, again, by the New Testament, by early Eastern Christianity, Syriac-speaking churches especially. They were very pro-Jewish in their tradition, in their liturgy, in their language, because there were a lot of Jewish believers in their churches. T2 is also rejected by Messianic Jews today, and also by many premillennialists today. So this is not an essential core of Christianity. T3, it is inferred that God's judgment of Israel in 70 and 135 implies irreversible divine rejection for killing Jesus. Now, we've talked a lot about this idea, this bad idea that all Jewish people are guilty for killing Jesus. We've dealt with that. But the key word here is irreversible. It's the idea that God had a final word with the destruction of Jerusalem in those 2 years, 70 and 135. That is God stamping out Judaism and the Jewish people. They're done. This is nowhere taught in the New Testament. It goes against the New Testament. It goes against what God has promised in the Hebrew Bible. It is rejected by many church fathers. They taught about a restoration of the Jewish people. It's rejected by Messianic Jews today. It's rejected by many premillennialists today. And it's rejected by the Catholic Church post-Vatican II, where they have repudiated these beliefs in T3. T4 says that it is believed that it is morally justifiable to use coercion in general to solve the problem of unbelief. This provides the ethical basis for the use of human force against the Jewish people. And as we've talked about before, T4 was rejected by pre-4th century Christians, and it's been largely rejected by Protestants after the 16th century. T5. It is believed that church or government leaders have legitimate authority to apply coercion to Jewish people to solve the problem of unbelief. This results in the ecclesiastical and political basis for the legal coercion of Jews. So it starts in the church, starts saying, okay, we believe that this is ethical and this is right. And then, okay, church authorities and politicians now apply this. And this is also rejected by the same groups as T4. Now in T6, this says that once coercion is allowed as a justifiable solution, the ethical limits of coercion must now be defined, including the morality of forced sermons, confiscations, imprisonments, kidnappings, book burnings, synagogue burnings, expulsions, and executions. So now you've opened the floodgates to coercion. Well, are there going to be some limits here? You got to figure out what the limits are now that you say that coercion is allowed. And this results in the working out of details relating to using force against Jews. And do you think that all Christians followed all of the guardrails on this? Absolutely not. That's why there were all of these things that happened in church history. So this is where it starts in theology and kind of the big picture worldview of ethics, of what is moral, what is allowable by God. It starts with the theologians of the church, T1 through T6. Now let's go to ecclesiastical ingredients. We're going to go E1 through E5. This is how the church changed its policies over time as an institution. E1 says that Jesus-following constitutions cease to be led by Jewish clergy. The result of this is that Christian affinity for, familiarity with, and submission to Jewish authorities wanes. Now, when and where was this absent in church history? The leadership of Jesus' followers was exclusively Jewish in the 1st century CE. Exclusively. All the leaders, the mother church in Jerusalem, they're all Jews. The Jewish-led Jerusalem congregation was the mother congregation until 135. That's when the Romans kicked all Jews out of the city, including all the Jews who believed in Jesus. After this point, power shifted to Rome and to Gentiles in general. Rome was not always the mother church of Western Christianity or Eastern Christianity. There were a bunch of different bishops, a bunch of different churches, and they all recognized that Jerusalem was the mother church. But that has been forgotten to history after 135. Then there's a power shift to the seat of political authority, and the Bishop of Rome becomes the most important leader of the Christian community, but that was a shift. It used to be led by Jews in Jerusalem. E2. Church leadership ceases to view Jews as brothers. This results in an us versus them mentality. Think about it. You don't have any Jews with you in your church. You're all Gentiles. It's really easy to make this an us versus them. We Gentiles are the us, and the Jews are the them. And this was less prevalent before 135. Because how could you say that the Jews in mass, in total, are outsiders, are the them, when you recognize that your top bishop of the mother church in Jerusalem is a Jewish believer in Jesus? You simply wouldn't say that the Jews are the them when your top leader is a Jew. And also you recognize that your rabbi, Messiah, is Jewish. That idea starts to become less and less familiar to Jewish people when there's not as many Jewish people in the churches. E3. Church leadership defines the church as essentially Gentile, i.e. non-Jewish. This means that there's no home for Jews as Jews in the church. And this was also less prevalent before 135. After 135, we see a growth of church liturgy and baptismal formulas that basically force Jewish converts to Christianity to renounce their Jewishness, to say that everything in their Jewish past was demonic, and they basically have to spit on their heritage and their background. That was unthinkable to Paul in the New Testament, who would say, Jewish people have, dignity and rights, and much in every way is their advantage, in Romans chapter 3, verse 1. E4. Church leadership agrees with and promotes replacement theology and coercion. That's T1 through T6 that we looked at in the previous slide. So that means that the church, it has the freedom and the justification to coerce Jewish non-believers. Now, when was this absent? The seeds of replacement theology were developing as early as the 2nd century. But no Christian coercion was present before the 4th century. And it was definitively promoted by Augustine in the early 5th century. So we're not seeing this justification of coercive actions against the Jewish people really until the 5th century. E5. Church leadership attains power and influence over non-Christians. This is when the church can enforce theology upon non-Christians. And when was this absent? Well, partial power was gained under Constantine, where he made Christianity a legal religion, but this was not really definitively established until the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, when Christianity was declared to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. So before 380, it was not the official religion. Afterwards, it was, but there was these exceptions given to the Jewish people as long as they were a subjugated people, as justified by Augustine. So those are the ecclesiastical ingredients that were progressively added to the mix over time. Now let's go to political ingredients, P1 through P5. P1 says that Christians may influence government policy from the outside. The result is that Christians have an audience with the state. They're not in the state. They're not leading the state. They have special interest groups for the state. But we don't really see much evidence of this before 313 CE. That was the Edict of Milan, when Constantine declared Christianity as a legal religion. Before that, it was an illegal religion. And we actually have a lot of evidence that Christians were, once they came to believe in Jesus and they joined the church, they were actually leaving political authority, political roles. There's church fathers who say, if you believe in Jesus, you need to leave the purple behind. And the purple is referring to Roman political government. We see that a lot of soldiers who were fighting for Rome, they had questions. Now that I'm a Christian, should I be fighting for Rome in the armies? And many of the church fathers said, no, you shouldn't. You need to renounce your post and stop being a soldier. So they tried to distance themselves, separate themselves from the pagan Roman government. After 313, that changes. Now we get to P2. Christians may influence government from the inside as legislators. The result here is that Christians are employees of the state. Now, before 313, with Constantine, Christians were barred from legislative service. They were political and religious enemies of the Roman state because the emperor was seen as a god. And the Christians said, no, we're not going to accept him as God. And this changes very quickly. With Constantine taking on the identity of a Christian, legalizing Christianity as a religion in the empire, Christianity went from nothing to everything when it came to the politics. It's not like there were lower governmental authorities that were Christians, whereas the higher authority of the emperor was not. It's like all of a sudden, night and day, Christianity went from no influence to a ton of influence because of Constantine. And then we get to P3. The government is dominated by a majority of Christian politicians. So with the rise of Constantine, he starts cleaning house and he starts pushing pagans out of the government, and later emperors continue doing that process to the point where the Roman government, you had to be a Christian to be in Roman government, especially after the Edict of Thessalonica in 380. This means that Christians are the de facto rulers of the state. Again, this was absent before 313. It becomes increasingly the case after 313. P4, government only allows Christianity as the legal religion. The result here is that church and state have become Christendom. And this is absent anywhere before 302. 302 is referring to the kingdom of Armenia, where we have evidence that the king of Armenia, he converted to Christianity, and then he baptized his whole kingdom. That sounds like forcible baptisms, because how many of them were actually believers in Jesus versus they just followed whatever their king said? Surely some of them, maybe many of them, were believers in Jesus, and they went along with baptism out of their own will. But this is the first instance where it seems like there was political coercion by the king of Armenia. And then that gets into the Roman Empire as well. But allowing Christianity as the only legal religion, it was absent before 380 CE in the Roman Empire. Finally, we get to P5. This is where the government enforces a variant of Christianity that agrees with T1 through T6, that is replacement theology. This is when Christendom becomes an anti-Semitic oppressor. Again, this was absent before 380, and it was also absent in some American colonies and in the USA from the 17th century onward, because they rejected coercion in religion, and eventually the United States put in the Bill of Rights, and they rejected coercion in religion, rejected a state religion, and then all of this bad history was undone. So we see here, with all of these ingredients, that these were contingent historical events that didn't have to go this way. They did go this way, but they didn't have to go this way. And none of these things were actually birthed out of what the New Testament requires or allows or says is moral or right. All of these were, I believe, illegitimate innovations in Christianity of melding pre-Constantinian Christianity, which was against religious coercion, now with religious coercion. And then you add that with supersessionism and you get all the bad history. My point here is that Christianity didn't need to go this direction, nor does it have to be this today. We can reject all of these innovations, P1 through P5, and all those other ingredients. They're poisonous to Christianity, and it's shown in how horrible these policies have been towards the Jewish people, and why Jewish people believe that Christianity is not only not for them, but actually a blight on the Jewish people. And I believe that these things need to be repented for, because this is not a good witness to Jesus or the New Testament. It's not true, and it justifies a lot of sin against the Jewish people. And so, let us now bring all of this to conclusion, concluding all 3 of these episodes, multi-hours, now into this final conclusion. My reading of the New Testament in its Jewish context, as well as my own religious tradition of premillennial Protestant evangelicalism, compels me to reject coercion in religion, reject supersessionism in Christianity, to affirm God's promises and covenants with the Jewish people, whether they believe in Jesus or not, affirm the pro-Jewish stance of the Jewish authors of the New Testament, to distinguish between the original intended meaning of New Testament texts from their abuse centuries later by supersessionist and anti-Semitic Gentile Christians, and finally, to affirm that it is possible for Christians and Messianic Jews to disagree with other Jewish people about Jesus, the Trinity, atonement, and eternal destinies, while treating the Jewish people with utmost dignity and respect as the elect nation of God. All of this, I believe, is a needed corrective to what has happened in church history. There is a better way. There's a better way to treat the Jewish people. There's a better way to interpret the New Testament in a way that is loving towards the Jewish people, affirming towards the Jewish people, and speaks accurately about the prophecies and the promises that yet await the Jewish people's future. I don't want to forget any of that. I want to follow what Zechariah and Isaiah and Ezekiel say about the future of the Jewish people, not allegorize it, not bring it on to myself and saying that I am a spiritual recipient of all of those things. No, those await Jesus' return, as we read in Acts chapter 3, verse 21. And I believe that affirming these things that are up here on the screen ought to change Jewish-Christian relations, the way that we talk to each other, the way we talk about each other. And I hope that this brings a better friendship, a better clarity, and a better way to partner together as both Jews and Christians can stand arm in arm in opposing anti-Semitism in all of its forms, whether it's coming from within the church or from within radical forces in Islam, coming from Gaza, from Hamas, from any of these places, that we can stand arm in arm in affirming God's plan and his purposes for the Jewish people. And so, we bring this all now to a close. I hope that this has been very encouraging trek through both the New Testament and church history. I hope that this gives you a better understanding of how to respond to Christian anti-Semites today. And I hope that this gives you a better openness and interest in what the Jewish people has to say about the Jewish people. So thank you so much for sitting through 3 episodes, these epic deep dive episodes on anti-Semitism in the New Testament and church history. I'll see you next time. Shalom.